the alternating 4-year cycle every 2 years, some of us, it's very possible. I ran as a special, ran in the general, I'm having to run again, and if I draw the wrong color of marble, I'll be standing right back here in front of you in 14 doing it again.
Oh, boy.
So that's, but it's because of redistricting, and then in 2020, do the same thing again. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to go back to what she just said about those amendments to the Constitution. Amendments to the Constitution are a really big deal. I mean, they truly are a big deal. And I think we had maybe 30 days from the time they were put on a ballot to even know about them. And then when you went to our news media to find out about them, they were all pro. They did not show the cons to any of those amendments. It was all the pros to those amendments. Somehow along this road, there has to, number one, be more time for us to look at those and more time to discuss those instead of y'all just making the decision, we're putting them on a ballot and you're going to have to vote for them. 3% is not enough people to come out and vote. That's a minority. That is definitely not a majority voted on those amendments. Amendments are huge. I just have a real problem with how that was dealt with. And if that's going to happen in the future, I have a big problem with it.
Can I
So
say
guess I don't
something
have a
about
question,
that?
I've just got a concern.
Can I say something about that? And this is not in defense of Senator Birdwell or anyone else. This is just the bottom line fact. We advertised that he would be here tonight over a month ago. Do you see the turnout? So it isn't a matter of how long do we have to examine them. You could have 6 months to examine them, and that same 3% would be all that did.
Then it still needs to be examined for 6 months so that we can get out and tell more people.
And it was 6
3%
months.
is not acceptable.
They've been out for 6 months.
Well, I kind of, but, you know, regarding the publicity of them all, I don't watch local news because, quite frankly, they don't have anything to say that I'm interested in. But periodically, I will flip it over, just see what's going to happen with the weather. And never once in the past month or so did I see anything about upcoming amendments on a ballot.
Unfortunately, it's not a lack of education, but an overabundance of apathy.
Yeah, that's what I
I mean,
think.
I wish more citizens had your rigor. But at some point, I mean, you talked about how the local news media was all pro, but our paper in Hood County, the paper in Waco, others had the pro con. We actually had there's a link to Texas Legislature online that gave a far greater detailed analysis. You know,
Well, and last month, Dan Davis was here at our Tea Party meeting, going through every single one of those amendments, saying the pros and the cons on every one of them at our last Tea Party meeting. So the information was out there. It's just very limited to people who heard it.
Well, I guess then my whole point is how in the heck did 7 of them pass? Seriously, how in the heck did 7
Same
of
way
them
we got
They always
Obama
do.
elected.
pass? Not a good enough.
let me take one more and then I'll make one quick announcement and then I'll get out of y'all's hair. Yes, sir.
I've got one question and maybe one suggestion. One question I had is regarding the ability to carry your firearm in your car to the employer's work site. Does that apply to federal, state, and local properties as well, or just?
No, you can't. No, you can't take it to the post office. It does not apply to federal, just state and local. There are still prohibitions on taking firearms to judicial proceedings, things
Well,
of
I'm
that
not
nature.
saying to it, but just if a
Right.
car is parked on the property, that's still prohibited. You go to the post office to drop off your
If
mail.
you're at the post office, it's federal property, the law does not apply to federal properties. You couldn't go to a military installation and do so, because, you know, like, if I'm on Fort Hood or I'm on Carswell, you know, I can't even take the firearm with me. And then, so in that sense, it's a jurisdictional issue of, we passed a state law that only applies to the state of Texas sovereign territory as
I'm
opposed to
glad you clarified
federal.
that. It does make it somewhat inconvenient when you're trying to do your day's chores. The suggestion that I had is, and I agree with the comments made here about the constitutional amendment, in that the amendments are serious business when you're changing the Constitution. Perhaps if you want to consider a constitutional amendment, maybe you should throw one out there that says if we don't get X percentage of the voters to turn out, it's null and void. It doesn't pass, period. 3%.
I'd just like to make a comment.
it's just like what you see here. We have approximately 52 people here in this room. Look how many people we have in this county, and only 52 show up. And she was pointing out that, well, nobody, only 3% turned out. Well, that's what we got here right now. Same as our tea party. We go to our tea parties. We try to bring people into our tea parties, or all of our parties, and we just don't get them to show up like they're supposed to show up. And that's our biggest problem right now. That's all I wanted to say.
Let me, again, thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to join y'all. My one shameless plug, as you know, I am running for re-election. I did put some brochures out there if you'd like to pick one up. It's got some of the comments of the various organizations, like Mr. Kerr, who's going to speak here in a moment. I got a question in Navarro County earlier today that was a great, maybe it was more of a comment as opposed to a question, but everybody talks about the freshman year, you know, they're really conservative and they taper off as they go from freshman into sophomore, junior, you know, become more senior and, for lack of a better term, insulated from the real world. I take these very seriously, and I take my duties and the oath that I raise my hand to support and defend the Constitution of both the United States and the state of Texas. Article 7 of the U.S. Constitution requires that state legislatures swear to uphold both constitutions. The most important thing now is for you to expect of me, you did it once, let's see you do it again. And that's exactly my intention as we continue to work, sweat, whatever it may be, to continue to advance conservative principles and not so much do something for you by passing out some benefit to you, but just protecting your life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and what you do with it is up to you. Thank you.
Okay. Now Jimmy is going to introduce our next speaker.
Without further delay, as old Ed Sullivan used to say, I want to bring our next guest up. Thank you all that did come for coming. Next time, bring a friend. And I brought a friend tonight. He's sitting right there on the back. Next time, I want to be on the front row up here. I did want to make a comment. The reason why Senator Birdwell probably is not going to have an opponent is because he's good. We can't say that about all of our elected officials, or RD. Did y'all like to look at the planes today that protected us back in World War II? Did y'all see those?
Yes.
It's a beautiful sight. All right, I just wanted to say one more thing. On these, this lady right behind me spoke about the amendments to the Constitution. I noticed that the Dallas Morning News, which I see all the downtowners with either the Dallas Morning News in their hand or the New York Times. Well, the Dallas Morning News told us vote yes on all 10 amendments. Now, I do a little old column over in the Ellis County Press, and I don't guess anybody reads me, but on my column, several weeks before the election, I spelled out as much as I could, and you could have voted all 10 of them no by my column, or maybe 8 out of 10, but 8 out of 10 you're definitely going to vote no on. So pick up the Ellis County Press. You know, you can use it to line your bird cage if you don't like it. I love that quote, center of gravity, that we're the center of gravity. We need to remember that when we are patting our elected officials on the back. We only need to pat them on the back when they do a good job. All right. We have here Andrew Kerr. He's with, this is a good name, Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. Empower Texans. That's us. Come on up, Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Jimmy, and thank you for having me this evening. It's always, I mean, certainly an honor and a pleasure to follow Senator Birdwell after he gave you an update on the legislative session, kind of answered some questions. give you a little bit of an idea who I am, what organization I'm from, what we do, why you're listening to me this evening. Some of y'all I think I've seen before. I did a training about a year ago, I think, at La Quinta about activism. And I'll be talking to you about activism again this evening and probably some other things. But first of all, like Jimmy said, my name is Andrew Kerr. I'm the Executive Director at Empower Texans, Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. We are a political nonprofit. Basically, we do dust-up stuff in Austin on behalf of conservatives. Can't tell you how nice it is to be outside of Travis County every once in a while, which my job affords me because I get to travel around and speak to a lot of good groups like you guys, and some small Republican groups, other grassroots conservative groups, and truly, this is where the true power of Texas comes from. When Senator Birdwell was talking about the idea of the center of gravity shifting from government to citizens and to taxpayers, it's true. And I would agree with him. I'd say that perhaps the results that we saw this last session were more focused out of fear, I would say, on the citizens because, technically they didn't raise taxes and they didn't spend the rainy day fund. But I would also suggest to you that there's a long way to go in the mindset of the elected officials in the state House and the state Senate. And I would say probably not. You listen to Senator Birdwell, and I believe him, he's a man of his word. He understands where the focus of government should be, on protecting the citizens. But I would say, I'll put it to you tonight, that perhaps another one of your representatives in Austin doesn't quite share the same viewpoint as Senator Birdwell. And when he was talking about the center of gravity being focused either on the citizen and the taxpayer or on government and government growth, I would say the majority of legislators in Austin, senators, Republicans and Democrats, despite a few good conservatives that we've got there, are focused not on how can we reduce the government burden on taxpayers and on citizens, but how can we grow and make government bigger. This is indicative in the language that they use. They don't talk about cutting government. They talk about not having enough revenue. That's telling me one thing, that they're looking for more revenue to grow government larger and to get more involved in our lives rather than less involved. So I would say we're on the right path, and certainly in the Senate, when Senator Birdwell, thank goodness he's only been there for so long. Yet he talks about some of the senior members that become insulated from the outside, and I would suggest that that's absolutely the case. A senator who is not seeking re-election up in Williamson County or from Williamson County, Steve Ogden, the chairman of the finance committee in the Senate, who's in charge of the budget and carrying out the budget from the House and the Senate, was so frustrated during the debate when they were planning on, the Senate planned on spending more money than the House did. They also planned on spending the rainy day fund. But he was unable to get those provisions to the floor for a vote because it would fail. And the Senate's all goofy about how they have 2/3. They have to pass, they have to agree to debate something by 2/3 before they can debate it, which in my mind is really silly. Even if Republicans have a majority in the Senate, which they do, it doesn't mean that you actually use the power of the majority that the people have empowered these folks with to actually debate conservative pieces of legislation, because you have to pass a smell test by a bunch of liberal Democrats. And I can tell you, usually 9 times out of 10, you're going to try and do a systemic conservative reform to government. It's not going to pass the smell test by all the liberals in the Senate. And by liberals, I'm not talking only about the Democrats. There's maybe six conservatives in the Senate. Brian Birdwell is certainly one of them. His record, short record so far, but a good one. I've heard some very, very nice things about how other senators would tell people, tell the clerk in the Senate if they had to step out and a vote happened, how they wanted their ballot to be cast. And it was emulating somebody who's still sitting in the room paying attention to what was all going on. So that's very good. And perhaps, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but I think we might see a shakeup in the Senate. Lots of people are deciding not to run for re-election. As far as I'm concerned, any change in the Texas Senate is going to be a change for positive. Right now, the Texas Senate, I lovingly refer to the august body that it is as the place where good things go to die. And perhaps we can change that. Senator Birdwell alluded to the fact that the Sanctuary Cities bill died in the Senate. A lot of people would say that because the House and the Senate couldn't get together on the TSA groping bill, the Senate was to blame. Now, I would place the blame at the feet of some folks in the House, perhaps the leader of the House, for why that didn't happen, despite telling people that he did everything he could to pass it before the buzzer blared at the end of the special session. That's a conversation for another day. I can tell you right now that despite however many people try and tell you that the Speaker did everything he could to support David Simpson's bill in the House to try and get it passed, it's a lie. It's a flat-out lie. And I'm happy to go on record saying that because I've got all the documentation I need to back that up. And that's just a snippet of the indication and the approach to government that you're going to see from the Republican leadership in the House. Now, certainly I'm not trying to cast a broad net over all the Republicans or there certainly are conservatives in the House that we need to support. And that number and those ranks should be growing. And that's our goal as an organization, is to help support those folks by providing extra accountability in Austin. Sometimes I get this so bogged down in a city that it's like a fog. I don't know what happens to legislators when they leave their home constituents after getting elected, because we all know in a Republican primary we're pretty much going to hear the same things. I'm the most conservative person since Ronald Reagan. Elect me, and you'll never have to worry about your taxes going up. In fact, we're going to make them go down, and I'll protect life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Of course, the things that Senator Birdwell says. The difference is Senator Birdwell can back up the fact that he acted on them, whereas the majority of these other folks that go to Austin, I can tell you, something happens when they travel down there for a legislative session. They forget. I don't know if it's a weird haze that surrounds University of Texas that's been there since the 60s and probably before. But there's something that happens, and they seem to forget the commitments that they make to their constituents while on the campaign trail, because they got nice and worked up about how conservative they were going to be and that they were going to win their election. Because I want to remind you again, primaries are where the real changes for conservative movement in Texas takes place. We can have general elections all we want. For the most part, those seats are decided. Congressional seats are drawn to favor incumbents. Statistics repeatedly show, and certainly not to say that they can't be defeated, because I earnestly work to defeat incumbents a lot of the time, but incumbents become entrenched. And going back to what Senator Birdwell was saying about some of his colleagues in the Senate having been there for so long, and Senator Ogden I was talking about, the example of when you see the level of frustration because of citizen engagement in government coming from a very senior senator, certainly has been there for a while, basically decrying the fact that outside groups had penetrated this chamber and they're forcing us to act irrationally. I mean, first of all, I thought my jaw just about dropped to the floor when I heard Senator Ogden say something about how citizen engagement was essentially a threat to the Senate. Well, I know the Senate well enough to know that that's certainly a good thing. But the fact that the idea is that the knee-jerk reaction is to be resistant to the engagement from people like yourselves that are advocating for smaller government that's more responsible, more streamlined, and actually fiscally responsible rather than pretending to be, is such a shock. And the more of that we can get going, and especially the Texas Senate, the more Senator Birdwell's honestly, we endorsed him last time. No one's running against him, and I'm happy to see that. We haven't issued an endorsement in the future. Based on his record, we need more folks like Brian Birdwell in the Texas Senate. That's right. And I think that we have some chances to dramatically improve the Texas Senate through some folks that have decided to retire, some people that are going to be running for it from the House. There's some challenges out there. And even if we pick up 2 or if we're lucky 3 seats and make them more conservative, not all the way, but improvement. When we talk about those 3-yard gains that Senator Birdwell was referring to as well, that's real in the Texas Senate. That will make a difference. And we have to be concerned about leadership. I'm getting way off the normal train of thought that I was going to present to you this evening. But we do have to look at conservative leadership in the House, certainly in the House, since the budget originates in the House. So much does or does not happen because the House leadership either allows it to or not, but also in the Senate, because we have a lieutenant governor that's currently running for senator of the state of Texas to go to D.C., leave his post. And we have to assume that that could happen. I'm not saying that it is. There's certainly there's a dogfight out there between Ted Cruz and David Dewhurst. I'm really interested to watch how that plays out. But I also don't want Texans, and certainly conservative Texans, to be caught flat-footed if Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst does win his election to become our state's next senator to replace Kerr Hutchinson. Because if that happens, we'll have a lot of the same type of thing that happened in 2000 when Governor Bush became president and then the lieutenant governor became governor, and then we had a vacancy. What happens when we have a vacancy is that before the next session begins, the current Senate will select someone from their own body to become the next lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor is a position that we get to choose who it is and who it's not. And in 2000, the Texas Senate chose a woeful, moderate Bill Ratliff. Bill Ratliff couldn't even get reelected when it went to a statewide vote the next time he was up for reelection. And it was an embarrassment to the Senate. But within those years, we saw some serious policy drawbacks to having that type of leadership at the helm of the Senate. Now, you may have some pre-existing expectations on what Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst has or hasn't done. But just think about the folks in the Senate that I've just described. And whether, if I've already said that there's only about 6 conservatives and the rest of them are moderates or liberals, it doesn't matter what their party is, there's a pretty good chance that the Senate club, which they've referred to themselves as a club several times, it's not unlike a private country club where you only get in to hear the discussion if you've got a certain card. They make a lot of their decisions off of the actual Senate floor behind closed doors. So it's all kind of kabuki theater. They come out and have a debate and to stand around and talk for 4 or 5 hours because they already know what the votes are. Those are the folks that they're going to be choosing amongst who's going to be the next lieutenant governor. And I would put it to you that we need to be telling Senator Birdwell, you need to do everything you can to make sure that this election, if it happens, it's a hypothetical. I don't want to make you think that Dewhurst is absolutely going to win his Senate seat. But if he does, we need to be prepared for the contingency of making sure that we do everything we can to have a more conservative person than what the default will be, honestly, in the Senate right now as lieutenant governor. And then we do that by talking to Brian Birdwell now, getting him to commit to you that he will do everything he can to make sure that that vote, when it happens, isn't a secret ballot, that it's completely open and transparent. Whether it's made in the Republican caucus or not doesn't matter, but what's most important is that that vote is transparent so that we as constituents can go back and look and see how each and every one of those folks voted. Because it's no secret who the liberals and moderates are in the Senate. And being able to tie that around someone's neck, some Republican who claims to be the most conservative thing since Ronald Reagan when he runs for re-election, which I think is great that all 31 of those guys have to run for re-election. That opportunity doesn't come around all that often, so it's good to see them actually have to run. But we get to see how they voted. So we need to tell Senator Birdwell, do everything you can to make sure that that vote is transparent. And do everything you can to advocate for a conservative in that position if that vote comes to pass. In the House, we have to focus on the same thing, except instead of the House, the House will select the Speaker at the beginning of the next session. And I'm fairly certain that there are several of you in the room that were engaged in advocating for a more conservative Speaker the last time around. So I don't feel like I need to preach to the choir, but that's going to come up again. And elections aren't won or lost on whether you're advocating for someone other than Joe Strauss or against a certain person in a legislative seat. It's won on the issues, and we're focused on outcomes, but it's still going to be in the back of our mind. It influences what policy is made and what policy even is considered in Texas. The Speaker of the House appoints committee chairs. Those committee chairs have the power to either bring legislation to their committee for a vote, to not hold them for a vote, or whether it moves on during the legislative process to make it to the floor at all. And I would put to you that there are several pieces of legislation that with a 101 to 49 supermajority in the House, pretty darn well should have made it to the House floor for a vote. Republican and conservative, you know, I mean, like, I would say conservative reforms, but these reforms are in the GOP platform. This is something that the GOP is having some problems with right now because they're torn between whether we advocate on behalf of our platform and the principles that we say means if you're a Republican, you believe most of these things in the platform, or whether we believe more in our bylaws. I don't know how familiar you are with during the last convention, there was a plank that was passed saying that, you know, look, at the end of the session, we need to be able to tell, you know, how our members of Republicans voted on platform issues. I'm no big Republican guy. I've never gone to a convention in my life. That'll probably come back to haunt me someday to say, oh, Andrew Kerr, the executive director at Empower Texans and Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, has never been involved as a Republican. I vote in the primaries. I advocate for conservative leadership. But the people that make up the Republican Party that go to those things, they want more accountability in their party. And that's the way that they saw that they could get it. Widely accepted as something that they should do. And you know, recently at the end of the session, people were asking, well, where's our scorecard? Where can we see how people voted? And the party has since said that, well, we can't do that. Because in our bylaws, it says that we can't engage in primary races and, you know, advocate for one Republican over another, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that that's necessarily advocating for one over the other. It's providing needed accountability in the party. If someone's going to run as a Republican and hoist that flag above their campaign, you know, we ought to be able to have some accountability measure to see whether they actually follow through with the beliefs that they say that they're claiming under that banner. But what we do is we need to provide more accountability in Austin on those conservative principles. The party's not going to do it. The citizens do it. We pay close attention, watch and see how people vote, and act while they're in Austin. We need to be focused on outcomes. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is, you know, past. The best way that I can describe the last legislative session, and certainly there were some accomplishments that Senator Birdwell talked about. I'll probably frame the budget a little bit differently because I think that he's right in saying we protected the rainy day fund. Texas did protect our rainy day fund for future uses. They did an okay job of prioritizing the spending of what Senator Birdwell was talking about. I think we could have done a much better job prioritizing spending, but when you're having to fight with Senator Birdwell was talking about all the liberal activist groups as well as, you know, a body full of lib mods in the Senate, you're not going to have the cleanest result as you'd like to see. In the House, darn it, 101 to 49. So we had a certain expectation. Now bring yourself back to where you were November 2nd, 2010. That evening, after most of the election results had come in, where were you? What frame of mind were you in? Sky high. You had what expectations existed?
Victory.
Right. I mean,
Change.
you know, for the U.S., we just sent a bunch more Republicans to Congress, and we think that that's going to be a good thing. The state of Texas, we picked up some 20 seats, far more than any pundit was expecting. You know, Paul Burka, this rather rotund guy who writes for Texas Monthly, was talking about commentating on several of these races, you know, back in October, November, and, you know, oh, well, you know, those big gains that the Republicans say that they're going to have, they're just not going to materialize. We're seeing results turn out much differently, this, that, and the other thing. You know, come November 2nd, there were 20 odd seats that Republicans picked up. Now, okay, that's awesome. Then, you know, after the election, you have two Democrats decide that they no longer wanted to be Democrats and become Republicans. So you end up going into a legislative session with 101 Republicans and 49 Democrats in a year that you're going to have to do redistricting. The last time the state did redistricting, the Democratic caucus, both in the Senate and the House, fled the state to Oklahoma and New Mexico respectively. And we had to have them come back to do the rest of our legislative business. This time, well, shoot, I think that the Republicans probably would have given them bus money from their own pocket and told them to get on their way, because technically they weren't necessary to carry on business if the caucus voted as a block. We all know is pie in the sky thinking that the Republican caucus is of one mind when it comes to a conservative agenda. Although should we have such low expectations for that? Now I think that we do, because those high expectations that we had November 2nd leading into the session, I mean, we were assured by everyone, no, it's, certainly the speaker was leading while we had a 2-seat majority. And he had to do things differently and do deals with Democrats when you only have a 2-seat majority. That excuse no longer exists. And so we were assured by people that said, oh no, my support is behind Joe Strauss as speaker. And for the rationale, because we're going to have a much more conservative session by default. I mean, that's a safe assumption to make from a casual observer. But we know the type of leadership that we saw in the past. We know the type of empowerment that essentially that leadership gave to those on the other side of the aisle. And I would put it to you that we saw not necessarily aid to the other side, but inaction. It wasn't forceful action to go out and advocate for conservative policies and conservative systemic reform that we needed, frankly, in this legislative session, faced with finally, the whole country, national and states, are having to deal with the fact that they've allowed their governments to continue growing to the point where we cannot support the government anymore on our backs as taxpayers. We're at the point, but the mindset, again, for most of those legislators still in Washington and across the states and even in Texas. Now, I mean, I'd say Texas has done a pretty good job. We've got no income tax yet, although keep your eye out, because we're starting to look for revenues again, and I'll get to that in a minute. We have a favorable tort environment, which was Senator Birdwell was alluding to, a new reform in tort law that helps businesses. We created a good regulatory environment for businesses, so businesses want to come here, want to employ people, bring more people to the state, and we've seen the benefit of that. But it's a lot like being the least drunk guy at the bar. We still can't drive ourselves home at the end of the night. I mean, sure, California and Illinois are like passed out on their shot glasses, but Texas certainly can't drive home. We've allowed the state government to grow at almost double the rate that it should have over the past 10 years. And we can't just look the other way when we see expansion in spending at that rate. So what we have to, we've got to pull the reins back, and states are beginning to realize this. And this past session, we had the opportunity and the numbers, frankly, to really do that, to really institute systemic reform. At the beginning of the session, a research group that does a lot of work for the conservative members of the House put out a study showing exactly where you could make $20 billion of cuts. Now, Senator Birdwell said the number was anywhere between 15 and 28. I think they settled on around 15. I think the state budget that was passed was 15 billion less than the last one. Because you can't spend money that you don't have. I mean, we all understand this. It seems like we have to continually educate legislators on the fact that, hey guys, when you're budgeting, when you're writing a budget, you can't spend more money than you have. Federal government, I don't even know if you can teach you anymore. But at least in Texas, we have a balanced budget amendment. We have to pass a balanced budget. So they're forced to. So as a conservative, I'm a little bit giddy at the prospect of gutting the crap that's in our government. Honestly. I mean, we talk about the Historical Commission doesn't nearly need to have as much money as it did, and obviously they didn't end up with as much. But we also have to systemically reform the way we approach government. The way we fund education is all kinds of screwed up. The way that we approach the property tax system, the gross margins tax on businesses. Seriously? I mean, everyone will say that's the worst thing since, the prospect of having an income tax, which some people claim that it actually is, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them. But we didn't do anything to change that. We didn't do anything to systemically reform government and move it in a conservative direction. We just kind of, and honestly, to borrow the line that Democratic operatives are going around the state talking about right now, is that the Republicans kick the can down the road. I can't necessarily disagree with that. Certainly in the House, we delayed putting off making hard decisions till next session. when some folks think that the will of the taxpayer and of the conservatives in the House and the Senate will be weakened. And we have to make sure that our will remains strong. It wasn't just because of the 30-odd, 35-odd conservatives in the House and 6-odd conservatives in the Senate that we ended up getting out of this session without having some form of a tax increase. That was because of you, because of your engagement in state government, making your voices heard, and honestly just being a pain in the ass. Pardon my French, but that's true. If we are not out there doing that type of thing, then they forget. They become insulated. And you'll see the House become more like the Senate. So that was kind of the past. And we would all say, the expectations of what we thought we would get and what we had didn't match up. Now I'd put to you, why don't you think that happened? And I think we've kind of alluded to it several times over the course of the evening. But it has a lot to do with leadership. Did we have conservative leadership? I would say that we didn't. We had conservatives, and we had a whole bunch of Republicans, but we didn't have leadership that was bought in to conservative principles and moving the state in a conservative direction for reform. In the future, we were talking about the next legislative session is going to be more challenging than this one was. They talk about having to face some serious budget challenges this time. Next time, the implementation of Obamacare, the bill for our health and human services and education are going to take up almost all of the state's budget. We have to figure out how we fund the rest of functioning government that we can justify its existence based on the fact that this time right now the state budgeted 60% of our budget for education. And yet people are saying that there wasn't enough money for education. I mean, I think we could probably go on all day, and I think I heard TJ talking to somebody earlier about education spending. I know I've spoken with Linda about it, and I've spoken with some other folks about the type of dollars that get spent for not education that's called education spending. And with the health and human services things, our hands are tied behind our back because they're all federal mandates. And we have to do a certain thing. And we did a good thing this past session and passed the healthcare compact, moving us in a direction that provides more control over how we spend those dollars to the states. Because I think devolving more power to the states is a good move. It's not necessarily, some people claim it grows government, but honestly, I'd rather have the state of Texas administering the funds for the health programs than the federal government, because we know how to spend it for Texans. The federal government doesn't, quite frankly. So until we can completely get rid of some of those programs, it's moving in the right direction. But the next session will be very challenging. That's why we need to make sure that we have good conservatives in place to not only fight back against folks that are going to be screaming for more revenue, code more taxes, and more government growth and spending, but we need true conservative leadership. And what's worrisome, and why I say that you're going to see this big blitz for folks that are going to want to increase spending, is that not a week and a half ago, the Speaker of the House in El Paso cribbed a line off of our president from June saying, you can't cut your way to prosperity. It's just not going to work. You can't cut your way to prosperity. Thinking about the mind, the headspace that you have to come to that conclusion means that you believe, for some reason, that government has something to do with prosperity, one, and that government spending has something to do for prosperity, and that you have to grow this government spending to ensure prosperity. And we all know that to be false. That's false logic, right? It's obviously coming from someone who is concerned about growing revenue rather than shrinking government. And we don't need Republicans in positions of influence that have the perspective of we need to grow revenue rather than shrink government. And because of that, it becomes obviously the direction and the policy position that the current Speaker of the House has taken on record, and then followed up with a reporter of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, I think a couple days later, when somebody asked him about it, because of course, our organization saw it and pointed it out that this is, we call BS on the statement. And so he kind of laughed it off when the reporter asked him about it. It was like, I made a terrible mistake. I was candid and honest. I mean, Joe, keep your mouth shut, man. But to me, all it does is indicate that that's the policy position of the House's Republican leader. And legislators that are signed on to that leadership, we as constituents can't do anything but question their dedication to fiscal responsibility and limiting spending. I mean, not even just assuming that we're not going to, we're trying not to grow government, but actually have to worry about tax increases. So our antennas have to be up, and that's why it's important that during these primaries, we're looking for leaders that can replace legislative lackeys. Our organization is going to do everything we can to support good conservatives and replace legislative lackeys with good conservatives, kind of a goofy tagline we're playing with. But those statements betray the headspace that exists within the Republican caucus, and certainly the Democrats. We don't even have to question that because that is their headspace. But the headspace for folks that haven't proven their conservative credentials to us as constituents and taxpayers. So we need to be asking tough questions going into those elections. Who are you going to support? Now, I think there's two people in this room that are currently challenging the current House representation we have here. And that's incredibly encouraging to me. Because for one, Jim Pitts did not help conservatives this past session.
He never has.
And I'm on y'all's turf, so I'm going to be as delicate as I possibly can and tell you the truth from my perspective, which is the truth. It's not, the truth isn't a relative thing, but I've been in Austin, so I have to pretend that it is. The chairman of the Appropriations Committee did not allow several bills to be voted on this past session that would have given conservatives the opportunity to have meaningful reform on the way that we approach government and approach spending and the budget in Texas. And frankly, that's not the kind of leadership that we need in the House. We need to replace it with more conservative, passionate, and principled leadership. And I would like to tell y'all to continue to be as active as you are. I know that the lady here was concerned about the level of turnout for the proposition elections. I was concerned about it too, but I'm not surprised. I have to say I'm not surprised that you only have a 3 or 4% turnout for a propositions election. In an off year, I mean, how many people turn out to vote for city council and school board in Waxahachie? I mean, in Austin, the political activist capital of Texas, it's dismally low. I always think it's funny because all these guys that are, drive around their electric cars and, have hemp stuff and they're all environmentally friendly and they're active in politics and they're involved in their community, they don't show up and vote. There's a disconnect there. And the folks that, I would say that actually, I'm very frustrated with the outcome of those elections, but we defeated Prop 4. And historically speaking, when propositions to the Constitution come up, they almost always unanimously pass.
Right.
It's incredibly frustrating to small government conservatives, but it's a lot like local bond issues in the middle of May. They put the elections when they don't think anyone's going to be going to show up to vote against them.
Except their people.
And so that's part of the illusion of local control. And that's the illusion of the importance. I mean, I believe that referendums are important. We have to hold elections that way. But there's an illusion of control in the way that they're carried out that actually disenfranchises voters rather than empowers them. That's a debate for another day. But, we have to temper our frustration with some silver lining. And the fact that on 2 of the worst, 3 and 4, we're pretty close. Well, 1 was like 52-48, I think, for 2. Correct me if I'm wrong. And 3, was 55-45. Generally speaking, when propositions like that are put up, they just pass easily.
In Ellis County, I think only 3 of the propositions passed in Ellis County.
Well, if you guys were getting the information around and people were paying attention, I mean, that's incredibly encouraging for me to know about Ellis County. But it's also kind of makes me question a lot of other things about Ellis County, why you kept some people around for a while.
We're gonna change that issue.
I mean, I say the same thing to folks in East Texas, because the folks in East Texas elect representatives like David Simpson, Brian Hughes, Wayne Christian, good conservatives in the House, and yet their senators are Senator Eltife and Senator Dool, which have long outlived their usefulness for any conservative policy. Senator Eltife actively opposes not increasing taxes. At the beginning of this last session, Senator Eltife went out and said it's crazy to think that we can run our government without increasing taxes this time. So I always enjoy the banter with the folks from that office. But I was encouraged to see that the levels of voting no on those 2 and 3, and defeating 4 was a big deal. What I think we need to take the lesson home is that this is what happens when you don't have an inspired and active conservative voting bloc. And going into next year's primaries and generals, we need to make sure that we show up. We need to make sure to get the word out. And I know there was a lot of frustration about the actual know-how about these amendments that were out there. And certainly you're not going to find it in the Dallas Morning News or major news media. No, they're going to be for giving the county government the ability to artificially increase the value of property so they can collect more tax dollars. I mean, why wouldn't the media, local media, be pushing for something like that?
Dallas Morning News was for every one of them.
Yep. And, I mean, perpetual debt. 2 and 3 represented something that is incredibly distasteful. Now, I mean, perhaps you can consider Proposition 2, and I know there's also some property rights issues there, but the state does. At least we need to be thinking about the future of our water infrastructure in one way or another. I don't know if it's because we need to spend a bunch of money on it. Probably not. But the fact that Proposition 2 and 3 both included clauses that allowed the boards there to repeatedly go back to the trough for more money without asking the taxpayer and perpetually putting us in debt is a serious problem. And we've lost it. Now I'm as frustrated as you are. But I think that we can take heart in the fact that we did defeat Proposition 4, and that we came close to defeating the others. It means we're moving in the right step, because several years ago, it would have been no question. Once those passed out of the House and Senate, signed by the governor, it was basically just waiting for November to come around so that they could have an election, so that they could go ahead and put them all into the Constitution. So I think we need to recognize where we're making some ground while we can, and continue encouraging our fellow citizens to get out and actually participate. I'll be happy to take some questions at the end now.
Andrew, if David Dewhurst if he's successful and wins the election in March, does he have to step down as lieutenant governor at that time?
No, not until he wins. If he wins the Senate seat, and then it's a matter of timing. He is. Yeah. I mean, there's like five or six of them. So no, he doesn't have to. If he were to win the primary, he would not be required to step down then. And if he did, we'd still be in the pickle that we're running. Man.
You talked about 2/3 vote. You have to have 2/3 vote before you can do something.
In the Senate.
He
Yes.
brought up something a little while ago that made perfect sense. If you only have 3% of a voter turnout in a community, it seems like it should be put back on the representative to get 50% of
Your
us to
line of
vote.
reasoning is completely valid, because if the Senate plays by a certain set of rules, where if
Why
they don't
don't
have
we
two,
have
if, no, I mean, but I think the suggestion was, why don't we have an amendment for the Constitution that if you don't have a certain threshold met of voter turnout, then it either invalidates the election like altogether. If you only have 3% turnout, and the threshold is you have to have at least 30% of voting age population turn out and vote, then nothing can be put on. I mean, certainly that's kind of what the Senate does.
Aren't
in a
there
way.
Back
over
on the
400 amendments to the Texas Constitution?
Yeah.
How bad could that document have been that it needs 400 amendments?
I know.
And why do they keep being brought up? Who are these people that keep bringing these
Well,
up?
it's the way our Constitution functions is different than the U.S. Constitution in a way. Like, there's a lot of administrative things that have to be approved through the Constitution. Development-wise, for cities to actually do things. There's a lot of kind of administrative things that have to happen. But when you're talking about bonds, I usually hear the word bond and vote no. Local, state, it doesn't matter. I just don't want to spend any money. Before we take the next question, I just want to our email list is sitting outside with some brochures. If you guys wanted to sign up as well, I'll pass it around quickly in here as I take a couple more questions. We don't spam you. Of course, you can't come to a political event without somebody asking to get your name, your address, your telephone number, your social security number, your bank account. But certainly we send about one email out a week. Try not to spam folks unless there's something really important going on legislatively or politically. Do we email outside about one time a week? But we're going to be launching some statewide programs in the next couple weeks, probably right after Thanksgiving, gearing up for the primary called the Conservative Leaders Project. We're going to be asking people to sign a petition, Texans to sign a petition letter to the folks that are running for office in their districts, senators, and running for House, asking them to basically not support an agenda that's going to expand government and to vote for someone, if they were elected, to vote for someone who's going to be a conservative leader in the House, for the Speaker, and for the Senate, encouraging senators that are running to put a conservative in the lieutenant governor's chair, if, hypothetically speaking, they have the opportunity to do so. And then secondly, we're going to be using that as a tool to get people engaged, whether through a campaign or helping us touch as many voters across the state to elect good conservatives that are running against some of these folks that need, frankly, to go home. So if you do sign up for our email, you'll probably see something about that in the next month or so. But that's kind of what's on the agenda item for us. But if there are any other questions, I'd like to get them before I head out.
Yeah, and first of all, you guys do a powerful service in what you give to people on your website, information about legislative action, everything. We congratulate for your input and contribution. What do you put for a number on the upcoming next session for unfunded mandates, unfunded